When you picture the March on Washington, you probably think of Martin Luther King Jr., his iconic speech echoing across the Lincoln Memorial, a moment that feels singular, perfect, and etched into the soul of America. It's a powerful image of 250,000 people demanding justice in 1963. But what if I told you that wasn't the first March on Washington? What if the blueprint for that entire event was drawn up 2 decades earlier, by a man who threatened a march so massive and so disruptive that it scared a president into action, all without a single person ever taking a step? This is the forgotten story of Philip Randolph, the man who proved that sometimes, the threat of a protest can be just as powerful as the protest itself. This is the story of the march that never happened, but changed everything. Act 1, The Powder Keg. Section 1, The Arsenal of Hypocrisy. To get why Randolph's 1941 plan was so audacious, you have to picture the world in 1940. The globe was on fire. Nazi Germany, a regime built on a grotesque ideology of racial purity, was steamrolling Europe. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan was on the move. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was positioning the United States as the world's great arsenal of democracy. America's factories, quieted by the Great Depression, roared back to life, churning out an endless stream of tanks, ships, and planes. Jobs were everywhere. It was a patriotic crusade to build the weapons that would save the free world. There was just one problem: this arsenal of democracy was built on a foundation of staggering hypocrisy. For Black Americans, the economic boom was a mirage. While the nation was gearing up to fight fascism abroad, it was practicing its own rigid system of racial hierarchy at home. A color line was drawn right through the factory floor. White workers got the skilled, high-paying jobs, while black workers were pushed into the most dangerous, menial, low-wage work, if they were hired at all. Signs saying, "Help Wanted, White Only," were a common, stinging reminder of their place. The booming defense industry, funded by everyone's tax dollars, was effectively a closed shop for its black citizens. This wasn't just a few racist bosses, it was systemic. Government-run training programs often shut out black applicants, creating a catch-22 where they were denied jobs for lacking skills they were never allowed to get. For years, black leaders had played by the rules. They wrote letters, held polite meetings, and published passionate editorials. And for years, they got nothing but empty promises. President Roosevelt, for all his public condemnation of discrimination, was a political realist. He needed to keep the country unified for the coming war, and that meant not upsetting the powerful Southern Democrats in his party, whose entire careers were built on keeping black citizens from voting. In September 1940, Randolph and other leaders met with FDR, pushing him to integrate the armed forces. The president listened politely, promised to look into it, and then affirmed a policy that kept the military completely segregated. For Philip Randolph, that was it. The old ways were broken. Polite requests were useless. He concluded that power never gives up anything without a demand. If the men in charge wouldn't listen to reason, he'd make them listen to the sound of marching feet. Section 2, The Organizer. The man who decided to challenge a president wasn't your typical fire and brimstone leader. Asa Philip Randolph was a tall, dignified, almost scholarly man. He spoke with a calm, precise articulation that commanded respect. But underneath that composure was a will of pure steel, forged in decades of struggle. Born in Florida in 1889 to an AME preacher, Randolph grew up with a deep sense of justice. He remembered his mother sitting in their front room with a loaded shotgun across her lap to stop a lynch mob from dragging a man out of the local jail. Inspired by W.E.B. Du Bois, he moved to Harlem in 1911, right as it was becoming the capital of Black America. He devoured books on socialism and economics and perfected his public speaking on city street corners. But his real training came from the world of labor. In 1925, a group of Pullman porters, the men who worked on the nation's luxury sleeper cars, came to him with an idea. The Pullman Company was one of the biggest employers of black men in America. To the outside world, porters looked like success stories. they were well-dressed, well-traveled, and pillars of their communities. But the job was a grind. They worked brutal hours for low pay and had to survive on the whims of white passengers' tips, all while enduring constant racism. The porters wanted to form a union, but they needed an outsider to lead it. Someone the company couldn't just fire. They needed a man famous for being incorruptible. They needed a Philip Randolph. For the next 12 years, Randolph led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, BSCP, in a fight that looked impossible. Pullman threw everything at them: firings, intimidation, even its own fake company union. But Randolph was relentless. He was a brilliant organizer who understood power. He crisscrossed the country, held countless meetings, and slowly, painstakingly, built the BSCP into a force. And in 1937, Pullman finally gave in. The BSCP won its contract, securing better wages and working hours. It was the first ever collective bargaining agreement between a black-led union and a major American corporation. This victory was more than just a union contract, it was proof. It proved that organized black workers could take on a corporate giant and win. And it gave Randolph the experience, the network, and the unshakable confidence to try something no one had ever dared to do before. Act 2, The Audacious Threat. Section 3, The Unthinkable Idea. In January 1941, Randolph went public with his plan. It was stunningly simple and completely audacious. He called for 10,000 black Americans to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to demand their rights. The protest, he declared, would be an all-out thundering march on Washington that would shake up white America. You have to understand how radical this sounded at the time. A massive protest, organized exclusively by and for black people, was unheard of. Washington, D.C. was a deeply segregated city. To the white establishment, the idea of thousands of black citizens marching on the Capitol wasn't just a protest, it was a provocation, a recipe for chaos. But Randolph's logic was crystal clear. Quiet negotiation had failed. The only language power understands is power. And the organized power of the masses, he knew, was a force that couldn't be ignored. The point wasn't just to make a statement, it was to create a crisis so visible and so disruptive that the government would have no choice but to act. The demands were just as bold. They weren't requests, they were ultimatums. First, an immediate end to segregation in the armed forces. Second, a presidential executive order banning racial discrimination by any company with a federal defense contract. These weren't small tweaks, they were a direct assault on the Jim Crow system. And crucially, Randolph insisted this had to be an all-black movement. He had plenty of white liberal allies, but he argued that no one will fight as hard to remove and relieve pain as he who suffers from it. This was about self-reliance and demonstrating black power and unity, ensuring the movement wouldn't be watered down. The March on Washington movement, or MOWM, was going to be an instrument of black agency, period. Section 4, The movement builds. With the call made, the real work began. Organizing a national march in 1941, without TV or the internet, was a massive undertaking. The engine of the whole operation was the network Randolph had spent years building, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Traveling from city to city, the porters became the movement's messengers and organizers, handing out flyers and setting up local chapters all over the country. The black press got behind the cause, with papers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier giving the march national publicity. From church pulpits to community halls, the message spread like wildfire: on July 1st, we march. Randolph also built a broad coalition, getting major civil rights groups like the NAACP and the National Urban League on board. Some of their leaders were nervous about Randolph's confrontational style, but the grassroots enthusiasm was so overwhelming they couldn't ignore it. The response from everyday black Americans was electric. The idea tapped into decades of frustration. It was a chance to finally fight back on a national stage. The initial goal of 10,000 marchers quickly started to look small. Soon, organizers were talking about 50,000. Then, Randolph, a master of political theater, started publicly declaring that 100,000 black Americans would descend on Washington. Could they have actually gotten 100,000 people there? Maybe, maybe not. But in a high-stakes negotiation, the perception of power is power. That number, 100,000, was a weapon. It was designed to grab headlines, inspire supporters, and most importantly, scare the hell out of the political establishment. And it worked perfectly. Section 5, The Anxious White House. In the White House, the mood went from dismissal to pure panic. FDR and his team were trying to rally the country for war and project an image of perfect national unity. A march of 100,000 black citizens protesting discrimination would shatter that image. It would be a global embarrassment, a propaganda gift to Hitler, who Randolph listened politely to every single one of them. And he gave them all the same, unshakable answer: the march is on, unless our demands are met. He wasn't trading a mass movement for vague promises. The more the administration pushed, the more he knew his strategy was working. Their fear was his leverage. The clock was ticking, and they, Philip Randolph, held all the cards. Act 3, The Standoff and the Legacy. Section 6, The Confrontation. With every attempt to stop the march failing, President Roosevelt realized he had to meet the man himself. On June 18, 1941, just 13 days before the deadline, FDR summoned Philip Randolph and NAACP head Walter White to the Oval Office. Picture the scene. On one side of the desk is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, aristocratic, powerful, the leader of the free world who had guided America through the Depression and was now preparing it for global war. On the other side is Asa Philip Randolph, the son of a poor Florida preacher, a man whose power came from union halls and working-class black communities. He represented millions of people who were locked out of the very democracy Roosevelt claimed to be defending. The president pulled out all the stops. He tried charm. He tried reason. He appealed to their patriotism, arguing a march during a national crisis would help the enemy. He warned them that he couldn't just issue orders on demand, telling them this kind of problem couldn't be settled with a sledgehammer. He gave them his personal promise that he would work on it. But Randolph didn't budge. He'd heard vague promises before. He calmly and firmly repeated his position. This was not a bluff. Their power was the march, and they wouldn't give it up for anything less than a concrete, legally binding order. He looked the most powerful man in the world in the eye and told him, without that executive order, we'll see you on July 1st. The standoff had reached its peak. The labor organizer from Florida was not going to blink. Section 7, The Compromise and the Victory. Roosevelt was trapped. He had completely underestimated Randolph's resolve. The risk of the march, the political fallout, the global embarrassment, the potential for chaos at home, was just too high. He had to give in. The threat had worked. The White House legal team scrambled to draft an order. Randolph, now in a massive position of power, reviewed and rejected several drafts, demanding stronger language. Finally, they had a deal. On June 25, 1941, only 6 days before the scheduled march, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802. The order declared, "There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin." It was the single most significant federal action to fight employment discrimination since Reconstruction, nearly 80 years earlier. To back it up, the order created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, to investigate complaints. It was a historic victory, one without a single footstep on Pennsylvania Avenue. But it was also a compromise. Randolph had to give up one of his key demands: the order did not desegregate the armed forces. That fight would have to wait for another day. And the FEPC, while a huge step, was created with limited enforcement powers and was often under-resourced. But Randolph knew how much they had won. He got the executive order, and he kept his end of the bargain. He went on the radio and announced that the July 1st march was postponed. The crisis was over. The march that never was had just made history. Section 8, The Echo of a Threat. The March on Washington movement didn't just disappear. Randolph kept it going as a watchdog group, pressuring the government to make sure the FEPC did its job. But more importantly, the 1941 campaign created a powerful new blueprint for civil rights. Disciplined, nonviolent, mass direct action could force the federal government to bend. And Randolph used that blueprint again. In 1948, with the military still segregated, he told President Harry Truman that if things didn't change, black men would engage in mass civil disobedience and refuse to register for the draft. Facing this threat as the Cold War was heating up, and needing the black vote to win re-election, Truman caved. He signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the armed forces. The Randolph playbook had worked again. The ultimate fulfillment of his vision, though, came 15 years later. By 1963, the country was again at a breaking point. Randolph, now an elder statesman of the movement, decided it was finally time to have the march he'd postponed. Working alongside his brilliant associate Bayard Rustin, who served as the master organizer, and a new generation of leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he helped bring the dream to life. On August 28, 1963, when 250,000 Americans gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, it was the direct descendant of the 1941 plan. When an elderly Philip Randolph stood at the podium, he was watching the culmination of a vision he had held for 22 years. That pressure helped push Congress to finally pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. Conclusion. The story of Philip Randolph and the 1941 March on Washington is a vital piece of American history that's too often forgotten. It's a story about a different kind of power, not the power of high office or inherited wealth, but the power of strategic thinking, iron discipline, and collective will. Randolph proved that a well-organized group of determined citizens could stare down a president and win. He showed that sometimes, the most powerful move is the one you're willing to make, so you don't have to make it at all. His legacy isn't just in the orders he won, but in the very strategy that defined the civil rights movement. He was the architect. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded Randolph the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a fitting honor for the quiet, dignified man whose audacious threat echoed through the decades, paving the way for a revolution. CTA. If you believe stories of forgotten heroes like Philip Randolph deserve to be told, make sure you're subscribed and click the bell so you don't miss our next video. And let us know in the comments, who is another overlooked figure from history whose story we should tell next. Thanks for watching.